The title for my talk today is Masculinity, Miracles, and the End of Dreams. And the impetus for this talk was twofold. It's always actually several levels deep, I would say. I think the first thing we have to say is that gender roles and masculinity is certainly up. Currently, it's happening. It's showing up in the world right now, and I think for all of us, it's important to kind of look at that and see how it is at our minds. How are we relating to these various different changes in gender roles and gender itself? So, as we know, we have the transgendered movement is really taking off here in San Francisco, and I think across the country. And there's more consideration about what gender means. The fluidity of gender, meaning the willingness to kind of look at gender more beyond the roles that perhaps society has given us, and take a look at it and see what is kind of the impact. Today, in the reading that Reverend Vincent gave to us, it says this: dreams show you that you have the power to make a world as you would have it be, and that because you want it, you see it. And while you see it, you do not doubt it is real. And so the course is very practical in the sense that it does say for us not to deny our reality. Don't deny that we're bodies. Don't deny, and it's not particularly helpful for us to say, oh, this world is an illusion, and so therefore I can just be enlightened. That's not kind of how it really works. And I think right now what we're seeing a little bit is some expressions of the masculine that I think are perhaps the shadow self, maybe some of the dark side of the masculine tendency out in the world that we see. Just give you some examples that I've seen lately is in our political rhetoric. We've seen just some really tough things happen. There was a Supreme Court Justice, Brett Kavanaugh, recently who was accused of sexual harassment. And he appeared before the Congress, and his appearance was really, his second appearance particularly, he became very aggressive and I think kind of hostile to questions that were made by males and females toward him. And that kind of, focused on that situation. We kind of have a president right now, President Trump, who gets a lot of support from a group of people that statistics say are kind of white working class males as well. So, and his rhetoric is oftentimes pretty, what we might consider aggressive and alpha male-like, and there seems to be a response to that. So people are doing it. So what we see is it's not necessarily what I'm saying is to judge it, but just kind of let's look at it and see what it has to say. Now, on the other level is my own personal journey with masculinity, and I kind of want to start with that first. It's not something necessarily that I've talked that much, but interestingly enough, my own experience with masculinity, of course, is formed like everyone else, as a child and where I grew up. And, I kind of grew up with a very white European background, conservative background, working class. My family culturally was mostly Irish and German. I was raised Catholic, conservative Catholic, I would say. And, so within my town, which when you're young and my family, which is pretty much that is your conditioning. That's where you're kind of conditioned. The masculine role was kind of like the strong stoic type. The masculine models I had in my family, which were my stepfather, I guess, maybe my older uncle, and my grandfather particularly, was very stoic. I can honestly say my grandfather, who was probably the most present male in my life, the one that showed up the most, I don't think I ever really had a conversation with him. Like a real in-depth, involved conversation. But he definitely had an imprint. He was, smart guy. He was an athlete. He played college football back in the 1930s, and so on and so forth. So, he had this big imprint on me. So as I was growing up, I adopted a lot of these, I think, kind of similar kind of roles as a male. So for example, I played sports, and that was a big thing to do. And I think that doing that, you know, kind of playing in an athletic arena, I played all kinds of sports. I was pretty good at it. I eventually even played high school and college football. And within those realms, you know, being kind and being sensitive and being vulnerable were not necessarily the traits that got you to be successful, you know. So what got you to be successful was performing, was being aggressive, being assertive on the field. Now that was on the field. It's not to say, I mean, I wasn't unkind or I wasn't a jerk off the field necessarily. I don't think that at all. But it certainly was kind of a training ground for me and how to be with men. So it definitely informed my, development as a young man. And so I remember that as kind of a, as a teenager and as a young adult, while I was doing these things, while I did possess certain skills and talents toward, being able to be successful at sports, being successful in the classroom, and so on and so forth, that my emotional intelligence, while I was a sensitive young man, I didn't have great communication skills. And I didn't express myself well. The permission in my family, the permission was that you, as a male, you could get angry. Anger was permitted. But you couldn't be vulnerable, you couldn't be sensitive, you couldn't express, feelings and things like that. It just wasn't kind of done. So it was interesting. Now, I also want to kind of take a look at, we'll come back to my story in a bit, but I also kind of want to look at the societal male. So here's the definition of masculinity. A set of attributes, behaviors, and roles associated with boys and men. The traits include strength, courage, independence, violence, and assertiveness. Now, I also looked up machismo, which is kind of like the alpha male, right? Get this. Think of someone, if you know someone like this. Machismo is a form of masculinity that emphasizes power and is often with disregard for consequences and responsibility. So, kind of looking at these definitions, fine. Now, I'm sure that there are many definitions out there. We could come up with many definitions. And it's my hope that what's really happening now with this discussion around gender, even the Me Too campaign that is trying to advance this cause for treating women with respect in the workplace and at home, without feeling that they are going to be harassed or intimidated physically, sexually, or verbally, that we're going to move toward that kind of that era. So I did some research and on masculinity and kind of like what is it that causes the version of masculinity, if you will, that causes problems in society, and also with the men who have these traits. And they actually did a study that was done both by an American university and a university in Singapore. So it's just not Western culture. And they found these problematic traits when overemphasized. Now remember, I'm saying no matter what, these traits aren't necessarily bad in and of themselves, but when they're overemphasized. So here they are. There's actually 7 of them. Winning. When you have a strong desire to be admired and respected for winning, this causes problems, can cause problems, or does cause problems. Emotional control. You keep your feelings in check and you don't express vulnerable feelings. Sadness, disappointment, frustration. Again, anger is okay. Violence. The willing to be tough, and throw a punch. Fighting at the bars over a few beers. Now, here's another very, very difficult one. Power over women. That you have this need to, to handle women, be in control of women, and you're threatened by women that may have authority over you. The playboy the playboy mystique, that your self-esteem is based on the pursuit of power over the other sex, or conquering the other sex sexually. Primacy of work. Now this is really interesting, isn't it? The prioritization of financial support over family emotional support. I imagine this one I thought about, like, this is a really tough one, you know, because I think it works both ways. In today's modern society, you know, so many men struggle because women are now being, you know, going out into the workforce, and a lot of families, women are making more money than the men. So I think men that have, you know, these masculine attributes that they've been raised with can feel inferior, can lead them to feel inferior in that. So it's also, you know, it's that situation. And so if I'm not the breadwinner, what am I? You know, and so I'm supposed to embrace a role that I haven't really been conditioned into. You know, so imagine it's really, really hard. And the last one is disdain for gay men. And we know, you know, that's also something that's really been part of it. And what they say that's part of this is sometimes like a hyper-masculinity, you know, like overcompensation. And we know also that some men repress their same-sex attraction, and that can also come out as a form of homophobia, and sometimes it leads to emotional and physical violence toward gay men as well. So it's a really difficult one. Now I just mentioned all those things, they're problematic for society, but they actually said 3 of them are difficult for the men themselves. That 3 of them, and I'll list them here: power over women, the playboy mystique, and disdain for gay men, are oftentimes precursors for those males to have mental illness. That there's a direct correlation for mental illness with men who have these things. So, you know, if you think about it, you just turn on the TV and we see a lot of this happening nowadays, you know, it's easy to judge these folks that we're seeing the alpha male out there, but in reality, they're high risk for mental illness, depression, anxiety disorders, and there's actually and this is I did this research too, the Center for Disease and Control. There is an increase in men committing suicide in the ages from 15 to 34, and men in general. There's actually a higher increase, and men are more successful at committing suicide as well. So this worldview of masculinity is kind of really disturbing. Now, again, this is not to put blame on men, this is just to look at the conditioning that happens in this ego world. Now boys, I'm an educator, I work with special needs students, and I have worked with, interestingly enough, I've worked in being a special ed teacher. Most students with disabilities are males. And it's almost 89% of people that are incarcerated in jail have some form of a disability or a learning disability. Okay, so it's something to think about. So the research in brain development says this, that actually boys' brains in the early, like boys developing their brains in the intervito and intravia, or in the mother's womb, and you know, in their first couple of years, their actual brain development is more fragile than girls. Like, we wouldn't think that because, right, we stereotype boys as being, you know, more tough and you know, more you know, rougher and all that kind of stuff. And this is what the research shows, that there's a higher sensitivity to the mother's emotional states. So boys' brains, if a mother has a trauma, boys actually have a greater, that impacts their brain development adversely more than it does for girls. Boys have a higher risk of ADHD, and they're shown to have higher cortisol levels. Now, if anyone knows what cortisol is, a hormone, it's actually the bad stress, what we consider the bad stress. Some of it is necessary, but excessive amounts is not good, because some of that little stress gets us to do things, but too much is not good. And what it does in young boys, it leads to cognitive impairment, like their thinking skills, and that affects social emotional as well, their ability to process emotion, emotional intelligence, and all that. So all these things are kind of, we have to, you know, look at this, you know, look at this as well in terms of, kind of processing what's going on with the masculine thing. So, so I think we need to, like I said, we need to keep all this in mind. Now, the big context. Now, coming back to it a little bit, back to my story. So, I think, like, we all go through our ego development. We form who we are at a certain point. Most folks, 18, 22, and I would say that I started deconditioning myself from the kind of the negative aspects of masculinity probably right around after college. When I started to become more honest with myself about my sexuality, I started to come out. I went to therapy. I experienced depression, for mental illness because, I was having a real hard time reconciling the conflict between, like, who I had appeared to be. I appeared to be this kind of like, football player. I was captain of my college football team. I had all these kind of, obviously, stereotypical masculine traits in that way. Conservative Catholic upbringing, although that was changing in my mind, and then I realized that, oh my God, I'm had this attraction to men, and how am I going to reconcile these two things? It seemed that my masculinity was really in conflict. But as I went to therapy, and I began reading books about being gay and coming out. And I also discovered kind of like progressive theology. I went to Dignity, which was a gay Catholic organization, and we began to discover all these things about sexuality, that in the early church there was actually gay people that marriages were actually sanctified by the early church, blah, blah, blah. That it wasn't the attack on sexuality and homosexuality didn't come until later in that history. So, gradually I came out and I did that. And another significant thing was when I was 35, I moved to San Francisco. And part of it was to kind of be free, to live in a city. I lived in Philadelphia before that, but San Francisco was like where you could be LGBTQ and beyond and whatever, and be accepted. And that was really important. And it was also really important because I came to study A Course in Miracles, which I think is very non-judgmental, loving, forgiving spirituality. And so that really, really helped. At the same time, like even let's bring things current, like for myself, I still have had issues with expression of feelings in my relationships. It's very difficult for me, even though I've gotten better. And so one of the things I've noticed lately, I'm 54 now, is that I tend to cry a little bit easier now, which is a great relief, actually. I'll give you one example. So recently I went to see this movie. It was called Crazy Rich Asians. And it's a romantic comedy, right? But there are some really poignant scenes in there between mothers and their daughters. And a daughter and a possible future mother-in-law. Really hard scenes that are taking place. And I started crying. I started tearing up and crying, and I really wanted to start bawling, but my conditioning is really very strong, and shut that down. But I thought, oh, this is a sign of healing. Even though Course in Miracles talks about when we're in our right mind, we're not crying, but I think it is part of the healing process. Is that we have to that in our minds we have these experiences, this conditioning that we do have to let go of whatever past traumas, past conditioning where they said you got to be tough, stick it out, don't cry, and I think that really stunts our emotional development. So I was really happy to have that experience. Now the other experience wasn't so happy, but my emotional response was different. A few weeks ago I was at work. I'm working in a new place, and I'm a school district employee, but at the same time I'm now working in a hospital setting, and the hospital has its own rules, and one of them is that we have to get cleared to work there. We have to go through an HR process. And I was like, whatever, I'm already hired by the school, you're not my boss, Blair. Well, this female supervisor actually pulled us in a room, there were about 5 of us that were newly hired, and said, I thought very crudely said, do you want to eat? Do you want a roof over your head? Then you better sign up and go through this process. And I thought, oh my God, that's terrible. Like that was a horrible thing to say. And so, but what was interesting to me is that my response was, well, I was kind of sad and hurt by this. I mean, that was my initial response, was like, here I'm working really hard, this new job, and I felt really, not appreciated, not all that stuff, and I got a little angry, and like my old ego self was, get the union, I stand up for myself, I'm a gay man, I've fought for rights, I've been in protests, I've done a lot of different things, but this time my guidance was, just, hey, like I had a more integral experience, it just wasn't the fight. And my guidance was, you better start doing this process. So, I kind of did that, and what the real gift of it was is that I had a greater experience, I think, of my awareness of my emotional experience. So that was it. All right. So, so what does all this mean about masculinity and myself, but also in society? And this is what the Course says. The Holy Spirit in whom his mission the Holy Spirit in whom his mission can be happily accomplished. You who are steadfastly devoted to misery must recognize that you are miserable and not happy. And so I think for all of us, I think what we need to do is we just have to take a look at these gender roles, whether it's masculinity, femininity, or the fluidity, and compare what aspects of masculinity are healthy, the right-minded aspects. It's important to be self-reliant sometimes. It's important to be strong and courage sometimes. But we also need to take the feminine, and we need to sometimes be vulnerable. We need support. We need help. If I'm depressed, I can't fix that on my own. That's my experience. I needed to go to someone to talk about it. I need to share with close friends, right? And so there are things that we need to do. So I think what we need to do is kind of like embrace those traits of the feminine and of the masculine, and that's to me a lot of what this gender fluidity movement is that we are coming about as right-minded people. We all need these blended traits, and I do believe that like the LGBTQ community has helped us see this, that's bringing up, and that although there may be a backlash going on right now, we may see the alpha male or the hyper-masculine coming out. Well, we're taught by A Course in Miracles that you have to bring the darkness to the light so that it can be healed. And I want to see all those people as innocent. I want to see all them as guiltless. And I want to believe that we're all healing these various aspects while we're still here, and making it a happy dream. So I think for all of us, the idea for us today is to let's bless that masculine, dark masculine side that sometimes appears in us and in our world, and let's hope for this blending of traits which will lead us, I think, to a more happy dream and a more peaceful, purposeful life. And that's my talk for today.